Welcome back to the Poultry Doc Podcast. I'm Dr. Blaine Moseshek. Today we're tackling the toughest opponent of the season, extreme cold. Winter brings unavoidable challenges, but with the right knowledge and preparation, we can ensure your flock not only survives, but thrives, safely navigating the cold season. For more in-depth guidance on extreme cold, poultry health, and other husbandry topics to keep your flock thriving, sign up at thepoultrydoc.com. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Poultry Doc Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Blaine Moseshek, and today we're going to discuss how to handle extreme temperatures, especially the cold. So it's not too cold here right now, but I know in some parts of the country it's very cold. Freezing conditions and ice and snow and all the such. How do you keep your birds warm in these conditions? We'll talk about that today. But first we're going to start off with, how do we know what cold is to a bird? Well, we know that if we look at egg production, let's say in commercial hens, if the temperatures start to fall below, say, 55 to 50 degrees, egg production begins to fall. And if it gets very extreme and the weather gets very cold in the house, or the temperatures get very cold, that egg production will go to zero. And those birds are starting to divert all that energy to stay alive rather than to produce eggs. That's a measurable sign of stress and something we need to try to avoid in our backyard flocks. So it helps to remember where chickens came from. The original ancestor of the chicken is the red jungle fowl, which evolved in the jungles of Southeast Asia, not exactly a cold climate. From that bird, humans have selected for any number of variations, right? Frizzles and bantams and buffs and naked necks and all the other sorts of varieties that we have available. Some of those breeds are more cold adapted than others, and some definitely aren't. Whether the bird could be thinner or younger, poorly feathered, maybe not feeling great, for example, all those birds are going to require different levels of care and won't be able to sustain their body temp in very extreme conditions. So that's where we need to interject supplemental heat into the house. Now, just because this chicken has feathers doesn't mean it can survive every level of extreme temperature. It's like saying this coat's going to protect me from a winter blizzard just because it's got some down in it. That's just not the case. Now, we're in Texas. It doesn't get extremely cold here, but it still gets cold. It's cold for me. And even then, if it doesn't get that cold here, we don't have the extreme below zero temperatures. Very, very rarely will that ever happen, but it does get cold, and it gets cold enough for these birds to require supplemental heat. My suggestion, knowing that stress level happens, say 50, 55 degrees, anything below that temperature is when we start providing supplemental heat in our coop. So we're going to take you inside the coop of the Poultry Doc flock, and I'm going to show you how we've set things up. Obviously, there's many ways to do things, and this is how we've done it here. The goal was to keep it relatively small on the inside. That allows me to tighten up the space. I can keep heat in. You won't see there's no drafts. It's actually insulated, and we'll look at some different ways we can heat the inside of the house. So we're taking a look inside the coop. As I mentioned, we kept it relatively small. That was intentional here. They're really only sleeping in this. With the number of birds we have, there's plenty of space. Right now, we've just got the one roosting bar in here. They're relatively young, so this is all they need. But what I want to talk about is supplemental heat, and what I really like. And there's a couple different benefits to this. One is the pine shavings. So pine shavings are very insulatory versus like dirt, which would be more conductive, or sand. So in the case of the pine shavings, one, it's very, very cold. And let's say we lose power. It's a great example. We lose heat, or things are really, really cold and you can't maintain, above freezing type temperatures. It's to pull the roosting bars, and now you're forcing the birds onto the ground into the shavings. And for the night, obviously from a welfare standpoint, may not be the best thing. They do like to perch, but in these extreme scenarios where maybe the power goes out or just extreme cold temperatures, getting the birds on the ground is going to be way more beneficial than allowing them to perch. So that's one option we have if the power were to go out, for example. The other thing that I really like, underneath the light layer of shavings, we've got a heating pad in here. So this is producing heat. That heat is rising up through the shavings. Now the shavings do insulate it a little bit, which is fine, but still that heat is going to rise. It's going to cause this floor to be warm. Another great thing about these pads, and again, these are like ag approved. These are designed to be in farrowing houses with baby piglets, so they can get dirty and nasty and wet, and there's no issues there from an electrical standpoint or fire hazard. But these pads, if you keep them on the ground, so if your birds roost on the ground, and if you put this under, if you've got a sand floor, this is a great example, sand or dirt, you can put these a little bit under the surface of the sand. And then what that does, in the case if your power were to go out, you basically created sort of a battery, right? Now you've stored that heat is in the ground. And so if the power goes out, that residual heat that's stored in the ground will slowly come out. So again, that's when those extreme cold temperatures, if the power were to go out, you've got one of these heating pads on the ground or slightly below, kind of buried, that ground will become warm, right? And it takes a while for that heat to dissipate, and that gives you probably a couple hours that the birds can continue to stay warm just with the energy that's in the ground. So that is always a good one for the heating pads. And one thing I would always suggest everybody to have is just the regular cheap old temp gun. These aren't very expensive, under 20 bucks. You can find them on Amazon or Home Depot or whatever. But you can really easily and remotely measure what the temperature is. So right now, the temperature I scraped off the top of the shavings is about 70 degrees. And so you can do this from afar. You can take a shot of, say the bird, like how warm are the feathers. Some people are worried that the infrared heaters that they have may be too close or putting off too much heat. You can just point the thermal gun or the temp gun at your chickens and determine what the temperature is on the outside of the feathers. And it's not their body temperature, but it gives you a good idea of the amount of heat they're getting. We've also had some questions on the radiant type heaters and folks concerned that the temperature within the coop is still below freezing. Now remember, those radiant heaters don't heat air for the most part, right? They're going to shine infrared light or infrared heat, and that radiant heat is what the birds is warming them up. It's not necessarily the air temperature. So that's a great way, again, to use the gun. And while the air temperature, your thermometer may show it be 20 degrees or whatever the temperature is, the actual the feeling against the bird, right, because they're feeling that infrared heat, is going to be significantly warmer. And that's where the temp gun comes in too, because you can see that temperature on the surface of the bird. So that's important. One thing we have in here, and I know I read a lot about, are heat lamps. The heat lamp for us is really emergency. If things get super, super cold, there's a red light in there, it's secure, there's actually no string, it's chained to the top. And it really doesn't stay plugged in unless it were to get extremely, extremely cold. So that is one thing. I'm not opposed to heat lamps. I raised chickens since I was a kid. When I was a kid, that's all we had, and never had any issues with it. As long as it's secured appropriately and your electrical outlets are all good and checked, you shouldn't have problems there. Same thing with the heat pad, right? We want to make sure from an electrical standpoint that's low wattage and that our outlets are grounded and all the other things. So make sure your power is hooked up appropriately. We've got a door in here so we can close the where the birds come in and out of. So again, that's going to completely really close this off. And one of the things too we see a lot of people talk about is ventilating in the wintertime. In those extreme cold conditions, we will compromise ventilation to keep birds warm. So short periods of time, like at night when they're enclosed up, we'd rather close it up as tightly as possible and keep the birds warm rather than worrying about humidity in those short periods. So we don't want to keep them closed up all the time, right, for days at a time. But overnight, extreme cold conditions, closing them up, limiting ventilation to the best of your ability is really important. Most people may be concerned about, oxygen supply and stuff like that. You'd be surprised how, even as tight as this is, there's still air that's going to be exchanged in and out, so we don't worry about that. It's common to hear folks discuss how to keep birds cool in the summertime. Temperatures approaching 100 degrees, it's very, very common for folks to be very concerned about their birds overheating. Totally understandable. So if we consider 75 degrees a nice, comfortable temperature for a bird, say 100 degrees is 25 degrees above that. So now we go the other direction, minus 25 degrees, and we're at 50 degrees, right? That's that critical stress point when we know birds start to divert energy away from production and just to stay alive. So if you're at 0 degrees, now you're 75 degrees below that comfortable threshold, right? It's just as important to be concerned about birds in cold weather as it is in warm weather. And those extremes in cold biologically matter. The further we push below that comfort zone, the more compounding those effects are. And that stress, that cumulative stress, compromises this bird's immune system and opens it up to other secondary bacterial diseases or other viral diseases as well, even parasitic diseases. So the less stress that we can put on this bird from extreme temperatures, the stronger its immune system is going to be to fight off disease. So one thing to keep in mind, chickens don't just grow extra down because they're cold. We need to keep them warm, not necessarily warm, but we need to keep them as stress-free as possible, and that means providing supplemental heat in the winter. The way we do that is, like in here, insulation is best if we can. Not everybody can do that, but an enclosed space, no drafts. In extreme conditions, we may want to close the coop up completely, limit ventilation, and Conditions may not be ideal, but what we're trying to do at that point is conserve heat in the house and keep these birds stress-free. If we compromise a little bit of ventilation, it's going to help us keep these birds warmer, and that's what's more important. So good checklist for your birds going through these extreme conditions. First of all, draft-free, so it needs to be a tight, closed coop if possible. Insulated is best. Small is actually better because we're going to conserve that heat. We want to provide supplemental heat, certainly below 50 degrees, and that doesn't mean we're trying to keep it warm and toasty inside, but we're trying to limit stress by providing just a little bit of extra heat for those birds. And lastly, we want to make sure the heat is safe, right? So low voltage, safely secured. Ideally, it's like an ag-based or animal-approved. It's not going to get too hot. It has fail-safes in it. So all those things are going to help us prevent extreme cold stress on our birds, keep them happy, and keep that immune system strong. And lastly, to end this, not everybody's going to agree with this because I hear constantly, no heat, no matter what. I definitely do not agree with that. As a veterinarian, my job is to protect the welfare of all animals, and especially these, our backyard flocks. Just because they have feathers doesn't mean that they can survive any extreme outdoor cold weather. We need to provide supplemental heat when necessary. So keep your birds warm, keep them healthy, and keep their immune system strong. Hope you enjoyed today's show. Like the channel, subscribe, do all those things. Thanks for checking us out.